I think it's time to make a start. My name is Keith Golding. I'm a trustee of the ECT, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning. Having made a couple of visits to Wicken Fen and enjoyed the boat trip and everything that's there, it's my delight to welcome Martin Lester. Martin is the countryside manager at Wicken Fen National Nature Reserve, where he's responsible for conservation, land and landscape management and development. Martin arrived at Wicken Fen in 1995, following 2 years as a conservation warden with London Wildlife Trust, 18 months as a ranger working in North Lincolnshire, and 8 years as a warden for Leicester and Rutland Wildlife Trust and Rutland Water. He therefore has almost 40 years of experience as a nature conservation manager, with a particular interest and experience in wetlands, including floodplain grassland, fen, reed bed and carr, but with a strong interest in woodland and neutral grassland. During the last 20 years, Martin has been involved in a 100-year innovative programme to revert peatland used for arable to a more resilient state by reintroducing natural processes as the main driver and influencer, which is, of course, the Wicken Fen Vision. Throughout his career, he's used monitoring to guide management practices, as well as more recently to identify progress and the direction of change within a dynamic landscape. One of his roles at Wicken Fen is to help evaluate monitoring and research suggestions and identify gaps in our knowledge and understanding. Martin, thank you so much for agreeing to present this webinar. So I'll now hand over to you, and let's see if the system is being favourable to us today. Martin, it's all yours.
Thank you, Keith. Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for the introduction and thanks for the invitation to come and speak to you today. One slight apology, it's an oversight on my part, but I've changed offices for this particular event because my office is a little bit noisy and I haven't unplugged the phone and I don't know where it does unplug. So if the phone does ring, it shouldn't ring for long, but apologies if it interrupts what I'm about to present. So let's get on with it. The National Trust has been involved at Wicken Fen, Cambridgeshire, for well over 100 years, in fact 122 years to be precise. And at a meeting of the National Trust General Council in April 1895, Mr. Herbert Goss reported on the importance of this wetland. It was the haunt of much wildlife and the rare swallowtail butterfly, he stated. He went on to approach the fledgling National Trust to see if they'd consider saving Wicken Fen. And 4 years later, the Trust bought their first 2 acres for the princely sum of £10. Now that gave the Trust only its 5th property and its first nature reserve, and 53 land acquisition, land conveyances later, they had acquired and secured all of the remaining undrained fen in this part of the world. They also acquired a section of drained land adjacent to the nature reserve, which it now forms part of the SSSI. Now, although the Trust were relatively new to Wicken, monitoring and collecting had been occurring here since the sort of mid-19th century, and we've got records going back that far. But as the traditional fen industries of eeling, wildfowling and the cutting of turf and sedge, as they'd fallen by the wayside, these gentlemen collectors had started to acquire parts of the fen, which they subsequently have bequeathed to the National Trust. Now, as you're all probably aware, fens developed over the 12 to 10,000 years since the last ice age, and more predominantly in the last 5,000 years. But the same areas have disappeared at an alarming rate within just sort of 200 to 300 years. And by the early 1900s, as Mr. Goss had reported, fens had almost disappeared. An area that had once covered 3,800 square kilometres was now represented by only a handful of isolated sites. A tiny fraction, indeed, only 0.2% of its previous extent was all that remained. And the main reasons were sort of arable farming, drainage and development. And this resulted in massive loss of habitat and has been described by Dr. Ian Rotherham as England's greatest ecological disaster. I'm afraid I have to agree with him. So apart from the factors I've mentioned, the ensuing fragmentation and isolation and the oxidation and erosion of soils, the vegetation was also changing in those few remaining fragments. Species richness and diversity was succumbing to scrub and woodland coal, recognised as valuable habitats now, but these changes spurred Doctors Harry Godwin and Arthur Tansley to set up a series of experiments at Wicken Fen. This was during the 20s and 30s to investigate this change and how it was occurring and why it was occurring. And the results of these experiments helped to develop the then new science of ecology. Godwin himself later went on to become an early exponent of ecological succession. Now, these experiments, or at least one of them, still exist today. There were originally, we believe, only 2 locations of 5 plots each. 2 of those plots were set aside as controls. The other 8 were managed on various rotations ranging from 1 to 4 years. Today, we still manage one of the plots, one of the locations, on the same rotation as originally prescribed. And periodically, we get students in from the University of Cambridge to come and replicate the work of the 1920s. The second set of plots, just out of interest, was lost for several decades. But in the late 90s, they were rediscovered, and by the end of that decade, we'd removed scrub from 4 of the plots. We left the 5th plot in deference to the control measures that Godwin and Tansley had set out. Unfortunately, we haven't resumed any rotation on that area yet, and it's likely that we will, or it will assume the same 3-year cutting rotation of the adjacent areas of the nature reserve. Now, the management of the designated parts of the site over the years from the 1930s to the 90s has followed many theories. Some of it based on traditional rotations from sort of historic times. These would probably be recognised by Godwin and Tansley and loosely based on their experiments. Others were somewhat more haphazard and evolved over decades in an attempt to cater for individual species or suites of species. And in effect, it was all in an attempt to hold ecological succession at a stage which sort of suited those species or groups of species. But by the end of the 90s, there were at least 15 different cutting rotations across the NNR and a very complex management plan. Following a vegetation survey in the early noughties, we produced a map of the various vegetation types. Over that, we laid our complex management prescriptions, and of the 15 or so cutting rotations, only 3 delivered any significant recognisable difference in vegetation community. And this was a 1-year cut in the autumn, a 3-year cut in the summer, and a 4-year rotation in the winter. On the strength of these results, we modified the management plan to include only 3 cutting rotations. And for the first time, as a bit of an experiment following scrub clearance, we introduced grazing to part of the site. Now, these significant changes in management were a big departure from what had gone before, but we wanted to make the management much more holistic and less about gardening. To monitor all of this change, we embarked on a kind of NNR health check, I suppose. It started in 2004 and continues every 4 to 5 years, and we complete a full survey of fixed GPS locations across the NNR. We use quadrats to measure or monitor vegetation at those locations, and these quadrats vary in size depending on the type of habitat. Now, the plant communities at Wicken Fen have always been a little bit challenging. They don't necessarily follow a pattern and often merge into one another, and sometimes making categorization quite tricky. Nevertheless, the results of the surveys over the last 15 or so years show that there has been changing compositions in some of our communities. Some have grown, some have actually moved, but none have disappeared. And this is quite encouraging because it was a dramatic change in management. But we will continue to implement a more holistic approach to management, but also continue to monitor the impact of that management. Now, at the time we were addressing this change in management on the NNR, we were also starting to evaluate the long-term viability of Wicken Fen. And in 1999, we embarked on our ambitious 100-year project to extend the reserve to around about 53 square kilometres. Despite the Trust's best efforts, species have continued to become extinct at Wicken Fen. And in modern conservation, we still suffer from habitat fragmentation, small areas, nutrient imbalance, new ecosystem engineers, and few of the sort of dynamic impacts that drive landscapes in other parts of the world. We needed a new approach. We needed to think big. We needed to think much longer term. And we needed to think holistically and more sustainably. And the answer for us at Wicken was the Wicken Fen Vision. Now, at the time of its inception, the purpose of the project was to acquire land that would then become part of the nature reserve in order to reduce the challenges of size, isolation, and bolster biodiversity. The project's now 22 years old, and whilst biodiversity is still a significant driver of the programme and the subsequent management, the project also sets out to provide benefits for people and the natural benefits of a healthy ecosystem. These include the sort of things that were once referred to as ecosystem services, and I'm afraid I still can't get away from that phrase, even though it's probably not the best description. But that's the sequestration of carbon in the peat, the storage of floodwater, and a sort of green lung. Cambridge is growing at, or the population of Cambridge anyway, is growing at a phenomenal rate, and these people will need somewhere pleasant and green to go and exercise and to enjoy. So it'll fulfil quite a lot of objectives over and above the original one of biodiversity. Now, the land that we've acquired and the project is a subject all its own. But in a nutshell, we're not prescribing landscapes or habitat. We're just setting processes in motion. Occasionally needs to be a bit of a kickstart, but once the system is up and running, the habitats and the subsequent landscape will kind of take care of itself. This breaks the programme dynamic, means that there's no endpoint, and thus I find it incredibly exciting, as do many others. However, along that journey, it's helpful to understand what is happening and what the results of our efforts are. Monitoring has played a significant role at Wicken Fen, and within the project itself. It's not so much about directing management, but as an indication of the direction we're moving. It helps to keep us up to date with change. It helps us answer some of the short-term questions, particularly where we've employed a new technique or a novel approach to something. But it helps us to sort of monitor how our practices are working. So what do we monitor? Well, we monitor all of the individual groups you'd expect: invertebrates, water table, vegetation, mammals, etc. We also monitor how grazers interact and use their range. We monitor plant colonisation, ground disturbance, and also we've also looked at the sort of carbon budget for our areas. And all of this is to help us track the change and the direction of change. Things such as how large areas and new available land is used by plants and animals within the landscape, how more diverse and changing landscape might impact species with more. And this change in these maps, this is maps that were taken, or the results were over a 10-year period. And during that decade, habitat changed from one of predominantly neutral grassland to a much more diverse mosaic consisting of over 20 different plant communities. Within this variation, we have seen a sort of continual evolving suite of communities and find quite novel assemblages. These assemblages don't necessarily fit known descriptions, but they do fit with the biodiversity that's there. The only factors that drive these change are the sort of re-establishment of natural processes, reduced drainage and periodic sort of inundation, natural regeneration of the vegetation, and the influences on that vegetation by naturalistic sort of grazing of free-ranging large herbivores. And these factors are continuing to drive change. And just as a sort of little story, I suppose, that highlights how conservationists, how we can sometimes become bogged down by preconceptions and prescriptions. That's just that project for being with having some top quality sort of bird wader passage and breeding habitats. Our grazing herds at the time had several hundred hectares on that area available to them, and they could move within that as they chose. But we were being advised by sort of well-meaning groups that we should remove the stock during the spring and summer for fear of the trampling of nests. However, because of our sort of desire to maintain this naturalistic grazing pattern, we left the herds in situ, and the landscape continued to change and develop over those 10 years. And 10 years later, we were being advised by the same groups that we should increase the number of animals on there and possibly even pen them in around those water bodies because reed was developing, and this grazing would help to control the spread of reeds. Now, it's worth remembering that reed bed is a habitat that only a couple of decades ago, the entire conservation movement was desperately trying to increase across the country. And we were being advised to control reed bed. That just doesn't bear thinking about, really. So monitoring has played a key part in giving us a picture of what changes have and continue to take place at Wicken Fen. Whether it's the designated part of the site or the rewilding areas, it gives us a very clear understanding of the direction that the habitats are moving. Within the SSI, SAC, and NR, it allows us to play a sort of traditional conservation role where we try to maintain our sort of Noah's Ark of the old fen. Further afield, across the rewilding land, our task is to identify any change, embrace that change, and see where it takes us. And thank you very much for listening.